We are going to move on to our next speaker. I would like to introduce Dr. Brad Lander. Dr. Lander is the Clinical Director of Addiction Psychiatry at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Lander has a PhD in psychology from The Ohio State University, and I know that he is personally very interested in this issue as he has served on some boards for recovery homes to make sure that people have an opportunity for recovery. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Lander here. Dr. Lander.
Thank you. It really is an honor. I mean, people say it's an honor to be able to be here to address so many people at once, and people that are so involved in the opiate problem. It's not just the opiate problem, it's the drug problem. And I think what we have is a situation where we don't necessarily understand the problem. A lot of our preconceived notions about what addiction is coming from a view of people who have not had the addiction problem themselves. So what I want to do is talk about what addiction is all about and what happens when you become addicted. And I want to start off with a definition of addiction, a simple one. When we talk about addiction, we are talking about a lack of ability to control behavior. The technical term for this is compulsion. This is when you know something isn't right, when you don't want to do something and you cannot stop yourself from doing it. That is a frightening and terrible place to be when you do not feel like you are under your own control. It causes problems in life functioning, social functioning, health, well-being. It involves obsession. Obsession doesn't mean someone thinks about heroin or Percocets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It means there's periods of time when they can think of nothing else. And then there's dis-ease when not being able to use. That's this feeling of discomfort. Something's wrong, something's not right with my life until I can get this drug. So the question we want to answer is, why don't they just quit? Can't they see what's happening to their families and their finances and their health? Why can't they just stop? Well, that's exactly the same question they are asking themselves. And so the greatest problem we have when we're facing an addict or working with an addict is our own expectations and belief of what they are capable of doing at any given time. It is helpful to always understand that the addict is always doing the best that they can. They're not deadbeats, they're not avoiding, they're doing the best they can. If they could do better, they would. Part of our job is to help them do better. So, in order to understand addiction, we're actually going to take a couple minutes and talk about what is human behavior and what is reality. And now that's a little bit heady for this time of the morning, but we're going to go after it. There's three things you need to understand human behavior. First of all behavior comes from my brain. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm talking about different functions like thought. Thought comes from my prefrontal cortex, this area right behind my forehead. It is the most sophisticated part of my brain, the most advanced part of my brain. This is the part of the brain that allows me to have judgment and prediction, goal planning, calculation. This all comes from my prefrontal cortex. But we're also talking about emotion. Emotion comes from the core center part of my brain. Joy, fear, rage, sadness are all coming from the core of my brain. I hate to break it to you, but love does not come from your heart. Love is all in your head, which we kind of already knew that. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When I am doing this, I am not feeling this with my finger. There is no feeling in my finger whatsoever. What happens is I start a bunch of nerve impulses. It starts here and sends a pulse to the opposite side of my brain, over here. If I was in a functional MRI machine, I was doing this, you'd go blip, blip, blip. Now, all my peripheral nerves can be intact and my brain can be intact, but if you cut that signal off, I can do this all day and I'm not going to feel anything. But this is where it really gets interesting. It works the opposite direction. So one of the things I had done before I got into chemical dependency, I used to work in a VA hospital in psychiatry, and I worked with a lot of returning Vietnam vets. So I was working with a lot of people that had lost limbs. And they can tell you there are days they can feel pain in a foot when they don't even have a leg. That's because the reality of the limb is in the brain, not in the limb. If my brain tells me I've got pain in a foot, it doesn't matter if I have a leg or not. Vision is another very good example. Did you know you don't see with your eyes? You see with your brain. Your vision is all the way in the back of your head. Here's where your vision is. Right there. Also of interest is the fact that your brain, your eye can only produce about half the data that it takes to create this image. So if your eye can only produce half this data, where's the other half of this picture coming from? Well, you're making it up. Your brain's filling in all the gaps. So how does it do that? It does that based on your experience. Let me give you an example. Very quickly, look at this. What is this? See, no, everybody's afraid to say it. It looks like an E. Most of you say, yeah, it's an E. But that's not an E. That's a broken line. If you came from a culture that did not have, I hope I showed that right, but if you came from a culture that did not have this letter in the alphabet, or I'd originally shown it to you this way, you wouldn't have seen an E. But based on your culture, that is what your brain saw. Now, all voluntary movement comes from my brain. We have a band across our head called the motor cortex. This half of my brain controls this half of my body and vice versa. Again, all my peripheral nerves can be intact, my muscles can be intact, my brain's intact. You cut that signal off, I can't move. And then finally, there's memory. Memory is not a singular process. Memory is a three-stage process. Your brain makes a ghost image of all this activity. We call that immediate recall. So that if I were to say to you, the color of the day today is going to be red, what's the color of the day? Yeah, pretty good. About half of you. That's not bad. That's immediate recall. If your brain decides to hold on to that information, it's going to take it to the center core of your brain, reform it into what's called a short-term memory, so that if I come back to you at 1 o'clock and say, what was the color of the day, and you can tell me that it was red, that's short-term memory. If your brain decides to hold on to that information, it's going to take it, reform it again into a hard copy, an actual is what we call a long-term memory. The interesting thing about long-term memory is you can only create long-term memory while you're asleep, which means if you're not getting sleep, you're going to have memory problems. Because once you wake up, your short-term memory dumps and it starts fresh. So all behavior comes from my brain, but here's the second part of this. My brain is chemical. There are no moving parts inside of my head. There's no hamster wheel, there's no little man with levers and pulleys or anything like that. Everything my brain does, it does chemically, and it does it the same way from the simplest brain, which would be an earthworm, to the most complex brain, which is a human brain. It works exactly the same way. What happens is you start a pulse of molecules moving back and forth across a membrane, which is a neuron. And it's like taking a rope and snapping it, and it sends a pulse to the end. The neuron is filled with a chemical. We call them neurotransmitters in general, but it can be dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, acetylcholine, any number of them. It gets pushed out into the opening we call a synapse, where there are receptor sites that are sensitive to that chemical, that molecule. Once you fill enough of those receptor sites, you change the polarity of the membrane from negative to positive, positive to negative. It fires the pulse off in the other direction, and repels the neurotransmitter back into the opening called the synapse, where the uptake pumps pull it back in. Fire, back, fire, back. Now, an earthworm has exactly one of these connections, whereas a human being has billions of cells with trillions of connections, but they all work exactly the same way. Now, all behavior comes from my brain. My brain is chemical, but here's the third part of this. Chemistry follows the laws of physics and mathematics. I didn't say suggestions or probabilities. I said laws. So, 1 plus 1 equals 2. It has the properties of 2. It does not have properties of 3 or 18. It's 2. I cannot will that to be any different. I can call it 4, but it's still going to act like 2. It means if I take this chemical and this chemical, and I put them together, and they go, boom. What's going to happen the next time I put those two chemicals together? I'm not asking what might happen. I'm not asking what's probably going to happen. What's going to happen? Boom. But I don't want it to go boom this time. It's messy and it gets all over everything. I don't have time to clean it up. Costs too much money. Boom. So we'll try it, like behind the back. Boom. It doesn't matter what I want. It's math. Okay. We're now about to put these three things together, and after we do this, you are never going to see life the same way again. You think I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. If all behavior comes from my brain, and my brain is chemical, and chemistry follows the laws of mathematics, therefore, all behavior follows the laws of mathematics. Now, this gives the concept of free will a real kick in the head, doesn't it? Human beings are very grandiose animals because we think we control everything. And if you can take us down to our molecules, down to a molecular level, we don't control anything. Now, before you get depressed or angry, once you understand this, you find this extremely freeing. When you understand you are not the master of the universe, that allows you to appreciate, to be, to accept. And that's a very good place to be in. But if you don't believe me that your brain is mathematical, what I want you to do now is, under absolutely no circumstances do I want you to think of a yellow Volkswagen. Old trick, but you had to see what it was that you had to reject, and by then I had it in there. And if you don't think that advertisers and politicians, understand this a whole lot better than I do, you know, the whole point, I took an entire year. My undergraduate work was at Purdue, and I did an entire year of what we euphemistically called consumer psychology, which really should have been called brainwashing. Because the whole point of consumer psychology is to get you to think what I want you to think, make you think that you thought of it to the point where you will defend it. But I am the one that put it there. So, our brains work mathematically. And even though we have trillions of cells, our brains are still prone to making errors. And this is an example of an error. If you look at the lines, horizontal lines, they look slanted. The reality is all those lines are parallel, and if you look at any two lines, you will see they are indeed parallel. But if you didn't know this was an optical illusion, your truth and your reality would be that those lines are slanted, and you would wonder why, if you put a quarter on one of those, why it didn't roll off. It doesn't make any sense. It's got to be a trick. Now, you don't think of psychologists and neurologists coming up with new optical illusions, but they do. I just want to point out how powerful this is. Hopefully, you can see square A and square B. Can you see those two? Okay? All right. Now, square A and square B are the exact same shade of gray. Now, I know you can't bend your brain around that one, can you? But if you put up a solid gray bar, you will see they are indeed the same shade of gray. Now, some of you are still saying, nah, it's a trick. So what I've done here is all I'm doing is photoshopping out elements. I'm not changing anything, I'm not coloring anything, I'm just photoshopping out elements. our truth and reality is not necessarily what's going on out there. This gets real matrixy, about what truth and reality is basically what our brain tells us it is, and that's what we believe. So we're going to talk about another area and then come back and then put this together. And I want to talk about the reward pathway. There's a bundle of nerves that runs from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens with fibers that project up through my prefrontal cortex. Now, in the 1930s and 1940s, they started doing brain surgery on people under local anesthesia. They were doing this because they needed to know where they were in the brain. And so they'd take an electrode and put it on or in the brain and put a current into it and basically see what happens. And they were doing this, so they said, okay, now we know where we are. But they took this opportunity to map out the human brain. And so they'd put the current over here, and the person, you'd see this muscle go like this, and say, okay, we control that muscle. Then they move it over here, and the person goes, I'm tasting salt. But they got down into the reward pathway, into the nucleus accumbens directly. They put a current into it, and the person started talking about incredible feelings of peace and floating and happiness and euphoria. All right, well, that's nice, but what was most interesting is what happened when they turned the current off. Now, when you turn the current off, everywhere else in the brain just goes back to a normal state. Here, when they turned the current off, the people became highly agitated, really upset. Just let me feel that one more time. I know what I signed. I got money in the bank. I'm not going to cooperate till you do. I mean, this is all on film. This is really fascinating stuff. And so that brought up the question of why is this so different from the rest of the brain? So they did a very famous experiment. They got a bunch of rats. They implanted electrodes directly into the nucleus accumbens of the rats. The rats were able to move freely around the cage with this electrode sticking out of their head. Inside the cage was a lever. Every time they pushed on the lever, it stimulated that part of the brain. No damage, just stimulation. Within 30 days, what do you imagine these rats were doing? They weren't pushing on the lever anymore because they were dead. This was a 100% result. Every laboratory rat was dead. What they would do is they'd go over and push on the lever at a pace of about this. Would continue to do this until they literally passed out from exhaustion. They didn't eat, they didn't drink fluids, they ignored the other sexual partners, they ignored the other rats. Rats are very social animals, they sleep in piles. These rats wanted nothing to do with the other rats. They would immediately go over and start pushing on the lever. They continued this cycle until they died of a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion. Now, in law, I understand you don't typically work with laboratory rats. We do. And I'll tell you something about a laboratory rat. They do not die easily. And to have them dead of their own behavior within 30 days to override their survival instincts is a remarkable result.
Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
They would just keep doing it for long, long periods of time. They would do it to exhaustion.
Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
And a rat wanting brain stimulation would brave a shock stronger than even a starving rat would brave to get food.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
Human addicts will pay just as high a price for their reward.
So in the second half of this experiment, they didn't just have the lever. The animal had to literally cross an extremely painful grid to get to the lever. And in order to reset it, it had to cross back over and then back again in order to get the stimulation. And it continued to do that, to take extreme pain in order to get that stimulation. Well, that brings up a really interesting question, is why do we have something that's that dangerous, that potentially fatal within our own brains? So they devised another experiment. They got a fresh bunch of rats, they implanted the electrodes again, although instead of using them to stimulate, they used them to measure. What does a rat naturally do that stimulates this part of the brain? Well, they found out it goes off in 3 primary conditions. When the animal ate, and the more hungry it was, the stronger the response. So it was really hungry, it got a big response when it got the food. When it was a little hungry, it just got a little response. We know exactly how that feels. When you're really hungry, how the food tastes and the whole body experience that you have. The more thirsty or dehydrated when it got water, and at the point of orgasm or a little rat climax, or whatever you want to call it, a rat. And that was the strongest response of the three, and now we know exactly why it's there. You've got to go to the brain of a rodent. And we look at the fact that it does not have a developed prefrontal cortex, so it can't possibly understand the concept of nutrition. If it doesn't know that it needs to eat or why it needs to eat, what makes it eat? Well, it's really simple. A baby squirrel is born with a sucking reflex. It finds the mother's teat, it gets milk. The reward pathway lights up. It's not drinking the milk because it knows that it builds strong bodies 12 ways. It's drinking the milk for one reason, and one reason only, is that because it feels good. This essentially takes us to the basic law of animal motivation. If it feels good, it must be good for me. And it is something that must be repeated. It's necessary. There's no logic or rationality to it. Stimulation, repeat. That's all there is to it. Now, this tends to work relatively well if you happen to live in woods or jungles or the oceans and mountains. Doesn't work quite so well for human beings, as we're about to find out. So now, finally, let's talk about alcohol and drugs. Because my well-being is dependent upon how well balanced my brain chemistry is, it has to be very well protected, and it is. It's encased in a very heavy bone, the skull. There's a fluid layer between the skull and the brain that protects it from shocks, so I don't hurt myself every time I do this, which is kind of frequent. But more importantly, my brain is protected by what's called the blood-brain barrier. Very few molecules can pass from the blood supply into the brain. Now, why is that so important? It's because if I can get another molecule to pass in, I have changed the chemistry of the brain, which means I've changed the mathematics of the brain. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. But 1 plus 1 plus 1 now equals 3 and no longer has the properties of 2. If I take this chemical and I put them together and they go boom. But this time I take this chemical, I add this chemical, now I add this chemical and it doesn't go boom anymore. I have changed it. Very few molecules can pass through the blood-brain barrier, but certain ones can. Opiates, cocaine, benzodiazepines, THC, alcohol, amphetamine, and a number of others. What they have in common is they can cross through the blood-brain barrier. When they get in there, they change the chemistry of the brain. Now let's take a look at what this means on a everyday practical level. So let's all take a drink, just one drink, one hit, one toke, one anything. Let's see what happens. And so all my logic and rationality is based on chemistry. So you take a couple drinks and then you start looking at the brilliant things you do. You know, like what you say to whom, how late you stay out, you know, all those things. But here's what's important. We've all been in a situation where there's someone obviously intoxicated at a party, heading for their car, with the car keys out. So you come up to him, you say, Joe, let me take you home. You've had a little too much to drink. I'll be glad to bring you back in the morning and get your car. What does Joe say? I'm fine, I can drive. Is Joe lying to you, or is this what Joe believes? This is what Joe believes. Joe is looking at this. Everyone else in the room is looking at this. I cannot convince Joe that he's too intoxicated to drive any more than I can convince you sitting here right now that that's 2. And if I browbeat you enough, maybe you say, okay, Doc, it's 2, can we go now? But it's not what you believe. If this were true, Joe's behavior would make perfect sense. I mean, if you're getting ready to leave here today and 3 people come up to you and try to take your car keys away from you, you'd be pissed too. And so this is Joe's reality. And whenever you're high, whenever you're intoxicated, you always believe you're functioning better than you are. You always do, because it's your reality. You can have emotional outbursts. I mean, we can do it with an electrode. We can get angry with an electrode, but if you take a drink or a hit, all of a sudden your rage parts of your brain goes off, and all of a sudden you become the Incredible Hulk. Rage starts to come up. And are you being, is the rage at, something realistic? Or is the rage based on distortions? He's trying to take my car. Bang! Senses off, movement's off, memory is also off. The process of taking immediate recall, converting it to short-term memory to long-term memory, those are chemical processes, so that if you start messing with the chemistry, your memory is going to start making mistakes. This process can get so screwed up, you can be walking, talking, moving, have no memory of it the next day. It's called a blackout. It's a chemical failure of your brain to convert immediate recall into short-term memory. On top of that, is your brain memorizing reality? Or is your brain memorizing distortions? It's memorizing distortions, and it's not even doing that right. So if you're trying to understand somebody who's using, you've got to understand they are in a different reality. They're in a totally different world, and they don't understand yours. Because it's not, it's bad, but it's not that bad. One of the other things these molecules have in common is they are able to stimulate the reward pathway. What do we know about anything that stimulates the reward pathway? It sets up a compulsion, a drive to repeat the behavior. It's not logical, it's not rational. Stimulate, repeat. That's what this part of your brain is all about. It doesn't know that this is harmful, it just does it. It's automatic. So, I use on a Friday night, what's wrong with doing it once in a while? It's because your brain follows the law of no free lunch. It means if you're going to take your brain out of its normal firing patterns and its chemical patterns, it's going to cost you. This is an example of a serotonin cell. Normally what happens is you release serotonin by someone giving you a big hug, or you feel the sun in your face in the morning. Serotonin releases into the synapse where it fills enough of the receptor sites to change the polarity of the membrane, fires, releases, the uptake pump pulls it back in. Now if you do ecstasy, methamphetamine, alcohol, what happens is you don't do anything to release all that serotonin. It just gets flooded out in 10 times the quantity it's supposed to be there. Fills the receptor sites, fires, releases, but the other thing the drug does is it blocks the uptake pump. There is nowhere for it to go. So it immediately just fill fire, like that. It gives you that really exaggerated effect. You're not getting the effect from the ecstasy or the amphetamine. What you're getting is the effect of the flooding of serotonin in your own serotonin in your brain. But you've got fluids that are flushing this out. You've got enzymes that are breaking it down. And so that when you're done using, you do not have enough serotonin to drive the system. So if your brain calls for a serotonin release and you don't have it, you're going to find that really irritating. It's going to be, get the sun out of my face, and God, don't touch me. You don't have serotonin, you can't feel that. So how long does it take to come back? Day, 2, 3? You got to understand brain chemistry to understand the complexity, how complex it is, and what happens when you start messing with it. This is a prefrontal cortex slide stained for serotonin. We can see in the first slide how much serotonin should be available to this area. Now you look at someone who's doing ecstasy. This is someone who's what we would call a raver, does ecstasy on weekends. After 2 weeks, that's how much serotonin is available to the brain. 7 years later, we are not fully recovered. Now we hope that it will come to a full recovery. That's a long time. This is a brain scan. We're looking at the brain from different levels. And the high activity is the light area and it's the light part, and the darker activity is the slower parts or the less active parts. So you give this person crack cocaine on a Friday night, 10 days later, this is how the brain's functioning. Now keep in mind that their coordination, their speech centers come back very quickly. So they look good and talk good, but this is how they're thinking. This is their rationality. We look at 100 days after one crack cocaine use. 3 months, still not back. It's like taking a 2x4. When you do a drug like this, it's like taking a 2x4 and whacking yourself in the head with it. You know, you drop the 2x4, am I okay? I am now 2x4 free, honestly. But am I okay? No, the swelling, the bleed, all the stuff that happened from that is going to take time to heal. When you do a drug that affects your brain this way, you have the same problem. Now we look at a SPECT scan, which is looking at energy level. So the way you read this is that a smooth pattern is a healthy brain. That means it's giving off an even pattern of energy. Now you look at someone who's been doing an opiate for 7 years, whether it's heroin or Oxycontin or any one, and you can see what the problem is. Now remember, this isn't damage, this is energy. After 25 years, it looks like this. Now we're expecting rational behavior from someone whose brain is looking like this. It's a problem. But let's put it into another context. So we look at people who naturally have unbalanced brain chemistry. It's not because they're using drugs or heroin or anything. It's just because they're born that way. We call these psychiatric disorders. A psychiatric disorder is an unbalanced neurochemistry. So we look at all the major mental illnesses, and we see they're due to some form of unbalanced brain chemistry, whether it's low serotonin levels, which is depression, whether it's high dopamine levels, which is schizophrenia, and so forth. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. Now, we have a certain understanding about mental illness. We would not go up to someone who's a schizophrenic, who's actively hallucinating, and say, just stop doing that. Cut it out. We wouldn't think of going up to someone who's got a major depression and say, cheer up, stop it. But we go up to addicts and alcoholics all the time and just say, just stop using, and expect a different result. And it doesn't happen. And it just makes them feel worse, because they would stop it if they could stop it. We're talking about a mental disorder. But there's another, when we're talking about opiates, there's another problem. There's another system that's being affected in very much the same way. We have natural painkillers. Whenever we get hurt, our brain releases endorphins, which is our natural morphine that we have. Now, let's say something happens. Oh, maybe something like this. I know. Let's see that again. Yeah. So now what we have is we have pain. So when we get pain, what happens is the endorphins get released and they lower the pain. Now, if I have an opiate, the opiate takes over. It controls the pain, and it does a better job. The other thing, though, it does is it tends to affect the endorphin level. It begins to reduce the endorphins because they're not needed anymore. And so when you take the opiate away, I still don't have any endorphins. So I get into another situation, maybe like this one. Let's see that again. Now we've got pain, but we don't have any endorphins and we don't have any opiates. So what I experience then is I don't experience pain. I experience pain at a whole nother level. When people who have opiate addictions have real pain, I mean, you look at them and say, it doesn't hurt that bad. Physiologically, neurologically, yes, it does. It hurts a whole lot worse than it looks. Yeah, maybe an aspirin will help you, but someone in addiction, it's not going to help them. And we see a lot of people that relapse because they get into a situation where they get hurt and then they have to take an opiate again because the pain is overwhelming, and then they relapse. And that becomes a problem. So what is addiction? How do you get to actually be addicted? Well, there's 3 factors that determines how your brain is designed and wired the way it is right now. First is DNA. You're born with a DNA blueprint of how your brain is supposed to be wired, and your brain begins to follow that path. The second thing is how well is your brain being fed, oxygen and nutrients. But the third thing is your environment. Your brain actually is shaped physiologically by who, where you are, what you're doing, and who you're doing it with. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm born with an identical twin brother, but we get separated at birth, so that I end up growing up in Costa Rica. So I've got to deal with things like light and humidity, sounds, accents. My brother grows up in northern Greenland, so he's got to deal with it's dark, it's cold, it's flat. We have the same DNA, but the longer we are in our environments, the more our brains actually become different. Your brain actually changes in response to your environment. So it does it 2 primary ways. One of the things it's going to do is change the receptor sites, in this case, pruning them back. The other thing it does is it disconnects from some cells and then reconnects with others. This is a physical process. It makes you better at doing what you're doing. If you've ever picked up an instrument or a new hobby or a sport, early on, you're really terrible. And it's slow, and you have to think through everything. But as you do it more and more, it becomes automatic. That's because you have these pathways that are doing all the things that you don't have to think about. Once somebody starts using a drug on a continuous basis or for a period of time, it is considered a new environment. The brain begins to physically adapt to its new environment, and one of the areas of the brain that's being highly affected by this is the reward pathway. Once you get enough change in the reward pathway, the drug takes on the same properties of food, water, and sex. No, it's not rational. No, it's not logical, but there it is. Now we have it, and now it's physically there. The definition of addiction that I've been using for a number of years is that addiction is the physical adaptation of the reward pathway of the brain to the repeated presence of dopamine-surging chemicals. Now, it creates a false survival drive, thinking you need something that you don't really need. Now, the American Medical Association has been using the same definition of addiction since 1956. And that has recently, in August of 2011, the American Society of Addiction Medicine came up with a new definition and now classified addiction as a chronic brain disease. It's not a behavioral disorder. It is a brain disease. Addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. The key word here is circuitry. It has to be treated, managed, and monitored over a person's lifetime. Once you have become addicted, once this part of your brain has adapted, it cannot unadapt. That's why we say once you've picked up an addiction, you've got it. There is good news. I mean, there is light at the end of this tunnel. But we have to understand that this is always going to be with somebody. As a chronic disease, periods of relapse are a fairly common feature, but not inevitable. And then in addiction, there's significant impairment of executive functioning that manifests itself in problems with perception, learning, impulse control, compulsivity, and judgment. And we are expecting rational, logical, consistent behavior from someone with this brain. Whose problem is that? We have to understand that this is how they are thinking, this is how they are behaving. And if we understand that, then we can intervene. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. I want you to look at how the brain of an addict is working. We look at brains from the simplest brain, like a fish brain, to the most complex brain, which is a human brain. And what you'll see is that we all have the same brain. If you have a fish brain, you add parts to that brain, now we have an amphibian brain. You add parts to the amphibian brain, we have a reptile brain. Add parts to the reptile brain, we have a bird brain. It is not the size of the brain that determines the intelligence of a species, it's how many components does it have. Well, human beings are the only animals that have a developed prefrontal cortex. But we also have all these other brains within us. And so we can break the brain down into 2 primary areas. Right above your brain stem, about the size of your fist, is a fully functioning, intact squirrel brain. Your squirrel brain wants what it wants, when it wants it. It doesn't understand future, doesn't understand consequences, it does not understand the impact of its behavior on all the little woodland creatures. It's not evil, it's a squirrel. And we have a squirrel brain inside of us. It wants to run, it wants to play, it wants to hit, it wants to laugh. But we have another brain. We have a prefrontal cortex that does understand future consequences, morality, and so on. These two brains typically do not agree with each other. My life as a civilized animal basically goes like this. I want. You can't have that. I want to go out in the sun. No, you got to sit here and listen to this psychologist talk. I know. You know, people talk about having an inner child. It's really an inner squirrel. And we have to deal with it. Addiction is not located in the prefrontal cortex. It is located in the squirrel brain. That's where it is. It has nothing to do with rational thinking. You've got to go, if you want to treat it, you've got to go after the squirrel brain and retrain it. And that's what treatment is essentially about today. And I know I'm out of time. I would love to spend a lot more time with you, but thank you very much.